Welcome to Votewatch24. Yes, Byline Times Live, coming to you from our studios in Southwark, where we dissect the campaign, this general election campaign of 2024. And I'm joined by Byline Times editor, Hardeep Matharu, and our political editor, Bienkov. So we mark the midway point of this suddenly called election campaign. We're 3 weeks in and only another 3 weeks to go. In fact, in 3 weeks' time, you, hopefully, if you haven't done a postal vote, will be going into the booth, providing your photo ID and voting in this, what I think our editor, Hardeep, described as a seminal election, something we describe in our recently edited Byline Times, not this edition. We've got a new edition coming to you soon, as potentially a political earthquake. But before we go into details of that, let's talk about the debates, because since we were last on air a week ago, we've had some political debates. We've had 7, 8 people. We've had all these things going on. And then last night, and I can tell you our political editor and Hardeep, our editor, watched these assiduously. We had Sunak versus Starmer again. What was your verdict? Adam, I'll go to you first.
Well, it was quite interesting. It wasn't really a debate last night. It was they took turns taking questions from the moderator, and then it went over to questions from the audience in a kind of BBC Question Time type format, but with each leader fielding the questions. It actually was a lot more interesting than the first debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer as a result of that, because they actually were able to speak for longer than 40 seconds, which was the rule on the first debate. And we've got some interesting responses from Starmer. Came under a lot of tough questioning from Beth Rigby, particularly on tax and on his previous support for Jeremy Corbyn. No great surprises, those topics. But he struggled a little bit at first, but he definitely won the crowd over. And the responses, I think, but particularly towards the end of that session, he was getting a lot of rounds of applause, and it seemed to be going down in the room. By contrast, when it came around to Rishi Sunak, he really struggled. There were boos, laughter. I think I counted 1 round of applause on one comment he made over the entire session. And he just looked kind of crestfallen, defeated. He looked like he just did not want to be there. And of course, this is after the debacle with D-Day, and in the same week that we've had the Conservative Party essentially conceding defeat and saying, you've got to stop a sort of so-called super majority is what they're calling it, which doesn't actually exist. But anyway, we can talk about that later.
We'll talk about that. Yeah.
And so he really looked like he didn't want to be there, and the audience appeared to pick up on that. He didn't show empathy as he hasn't done in previous debates. At one point, he blamed NHS waiting lists on doctor strikes just after a junior doctor had been speaking, which went down very badly in the room. And it showed up in the polls. So there was a snap poll by Bienjov in immediate aftermath of the leaders' event. And it was judged that Starmer had won by 64 to 36, I think it was, or something along those lines.
And this is because remember, there was contesting issues over the last poll. Over the first debate was whether they'd polled people who should not express their political preferences. Was this on the same sort of regime as the last one?
It was actually, it was a very similar question. I think the problem last time is it's just such a scrappy, noisy debate.
Right.
That it was pretty much 50-50 neck and neck. It was hard for people to actually judge how they were doing. Whereas this time, it was a long session. They could really expand on their ideas, and people got a much better sense of what the leaders were about. And that wasn't a good result for Rishi Sunak.
Hardeep, so they obviously changed the format after that first debate. People could have criticised it off. We had another BBC debate, didn't we? Michelle Hussein. Everybody said it was much better. Comparing the two, did you feel that? And what was the mood shift that meant that the crowd sort of got behind Starmer or went against Sunak? Was it positive or negative? Well, how do you think it went?
I agree with Adam. The format was so much better because they were actually interviewed fairly forensically and then got to answer questions from the audience. I really, as we were talking about last time on the podcast, Peter, I'm not a fan of this sort of 35 seconds to answer the questions and that sort of contest, that very US presidential style debate. I just don't think really works in the UK, let alone the spin room, which I'm not sure why we need to have a spin room. And then the journalists say we're going to unspin the spin in the spin room. Well, why have a spin room to begin with?
Round.
But what I found interesting was Keir Starmer went first, and he had a lot of detail and knowledge to hand about Grimsby, which is where the debate was being, or the discussion was being held. And when members of the audience asked him questions, he was actually able, I think, to point to a number of things that were going on locally, regionally, and actually engaged much more with what people were bringing up. In contrast, Rishi Sunak, he just sticks to his party lines. It's, very abstract, broad brush, sort of claims to have, achieved certain things in 14 years in power nationally.
Right.
Again, like Adam said, very little connection, either through empathy or of local knowledge of where he was. And yeah, he didn't look like he wanted to be there. And I think what's emerging again and again, because there was also an ITV interview that Rishi Sunak
yes, we should talk about that separately,
with
maybe.
Paul Brand, and it went out on the same time, 7 o'clock last night. And
just before, wasn't it?
Yeah, or just before.
Yeah.
And it's that, as well as, the lack of empathy issues, again, the lack of connection, Rishi Sunak saying Sky TV was the lack of privilege that he had growing up.
It didn't have a dish.
I think exactly, which I think is in itself sort of just very odd thing to say, regardless of anything personally. As a politician, why say that? Why not just say, I was very privileged and I want everyone to enjoy the same opportunities? But again and again, what's coming up in these interviews is after 14 years of Conservatives in power, the majority of people in polls are saying that things are now worse than they were. And that has to be down to, the four prime ministers.
Five. Yeah.
The 5 prime ministers, the financial crash, austerity, the hard Brexit, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, all of these things, Sunak has to answer. And it doesn't matter that he's just been there for 18 months. He's being judged on that entire record. And
as he should be.
As he should be, and I agree with Adam, he just doesn't have the answers to any of it.
Just interesting, obviously Starmer is trained as a barrister, and one of the classic abilities of a barrister, because they're not the solicitors dealing with the case, are they? The solicitor amasses a case, and then a barrister coming into court often masters his brief or her brief overnight. So you think that Starmer had impressed the audience maybe with a sense that he was less, operating around spin and big claims, that he actually has a kind of a mind which does retain facts, which does address local issues.
Yeah, and enough political nous to know that you have to at least try to engage with what people are saying. So Rishi Sunak, I think one of the final questions he took was from a young person in the audience who made the point that was so obvious to Sunak: why are you moving your party so far away from my demographic when we are surely the future of this country?
Good question. Yeah, what was the answer to that?
He didn't really say anything. He talked about maybe reintroducing Help to Buy. He felt that the main problem on housing, for example, was the lack of people being able to save for deposits. He said that they've told, it's been indicated to him that people can just about afford mortgage payments but not deposits. Of course, not even thinking about all those people who are in the rental market, who are,
or homeless,
or can't, are just struggling with how much rents are going up and the processes around landlords. So it's just
the elitism begins.
And he also sort of resorted to talking about his plans on university, saying, scrap rip off university courses. If your sort of big selling point to young people is we're going to make it harder for you to go to university, that's not really, that's not really going to get you very far.
Well, the only way they counter that is making it harder for them to vote, it seems, with the ID cards they have.
There was also a Conservative, I think Conservative member who had been a volunteer or part of a local association in the audience. She asked a question, and I thought that was quite powerful because she was saying, look, I mean, I never thought I'd really say this, but after 14 years, this trust has completely obliterated. Wow. What should be done about that? She brought up the pandemic and she brought up Partygate as well. And, for which we forget, Sunak received a fixed penalty notice and he apologized again, but just seems to say that he knows things have been difficult, but attributes that to the pandemic and the full invasion of Ukraine, increasing energy prices.
It's Grimsby. We're part of our documentary, The Great Brexit Betrayal, is filmed there because there was promises about fishing, which is very reliant on what used to be the biggest fishing port, one of the biggest in the world in the 50s. Was the B word brought up, Brexit, or did anybody just get no?
I can't remember it coming up.
Yes.
But yeah.
Really?
So this is a key issue actually for Grimsby. Okay, let's move to another
Or
B
maybe, or I think Beth Rigby asked Rishi Sunak and said he had been the original Brexiteer.
That's right. Yes.
And he said, "Was I?"
He seems
Oh, right.
Exactly
So
like that. Was I?
Nobody can remember anymore supporting Brexit.
I don't know. It was something around that, but again, didn't really address
let's
it.
go to the other B word, and because we haven't done a broadcast since this emerged, which was the D-Day celebrations, 80th anniversary last Wednesday, was it a week ago or so ago? So we didn't cover this. Fortunately, and we are grateful to our media colleagues, we try to be what the papers don't say, what the TV doesn't report. It was covered extensively. This extraordinary flight back before the international ceremony with Biden and Macron and the German Chancellor, which was attended instead by David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron. And Rishi Sunak had flown back, missed this international ceremony, in order to do this really important interview with Paul Brand from ITN. So that was finally broadcast a week later. Just before we get onto the content of that, do we know more, Adam, now? It seems to be that this wasn't accidental. There was an element of snub the Europeans to this, or is that unfair?
Well, we still haven't got an explanation as to why he left. I mean, he's apologised multiple times, but he's never actually explained why it was. I mean, initially, the sort of explanation was that he came back for this interview.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really, I mean, the interview turned out to be pretty disastrous for him as it happened.
Yeah.
But that doesn't really stack up. I think he's got a record actually of not wanting to do these kinds of things.
Right.
We've seen in the past he's sort of snubbed climate conferences and G7 events. He doesn't like that side of the job. He doesn't like the ceremonial side of it. He doesn't like being the sort of world leader on the world stage, which is strange for somebody who wants to be prime minister, because surely that's.
But do you think somebody who's height? I'm not being so. When he's those photographs, you know, he does look quite. I just wonder if he doesn't finds the camera unfriendly. That's a silly thought, by the way.
I mean, somebody was just it is a sort of Brexit snub, and certainly in the defence of it from Grant Shapps and others this week, they've said, "Oh, we went to the British event," you know, and Sunak as well said, he said we went to the British event, but not the sort of foreign event, you know.
Wasn't D-Day a slightly foreign event? It involved sort of four major allies coming together to defeat Nazi Germany.
I think that's the problem for it. There isn't really a good explanation for it, and that's why I think it's become such a big story, because there is no real justification for doing that.
So, but the thing he flew back for, Hardy, was the this Paul Brand interview. Did you watch that? What did you make of it?
I mean, the thing I most remember is the Sky TV comment.
Just to explain that again. Yeah, so people don't know, just in case they didn't follow that.
Yeah, I mean, so Paul Brand rightfully asked Rishi Sunak about his ability to connect to members of the public, because he's richer than the reigning monarch in this country. And it should be said, because of his marriage to his wife, whose father is a billionaire.
He was a millionaire himself, because Sunak made $5 million out of the 2008 crash, right? And just to clarify, because there's some argument about this with John Sopel saying, you know, his mother owned a pharmacy, but it's quite a wealthy family, and they were wealthy, I think maybe had a chain of pharmacies, wealthy enough to send him to one of the top private schools, which is Winchester, isn't it?
So he made that point and said because his parents were intent on saving for his education, they went without other things. But when he was pressed on what exactly, all he could say was famously Sky TV, that they didn't have a subscription, I guess.
I think Sky TV didn't actually become a thing until he was about 9 years old.
Yeah. It was BSB. I think it's 1990 when the Sky is launched, and then they merged in the mid-90s.
And also, I think in the early days of Sky, actually, it was almost a class signifier to not have it.
I think you're right. Some people disagreed with that. It was Square Reels.
The dish, yeah.
That was. I lived in Greenwich, quite a rundown area, and it was like a sign. You know, I'm not this. What the working classes would be getting the Square Reels and the dishes. The middle class houses didn't like them on.
But I think it just that kind of he's just not very good at thinking on his feet. And we saw this in the event last night. He was asked I think the final question from Beth Rigby was, "Can you tell us something that would make people think better of you and think more of you?" And he's like, you can see like the panic in his eyes. And he said, "Oh well, I quite like I eat a lot of sugar." It's like, is that the best you can come up with? You know, is that meant to persuade the country?
Is this a Theresa May moment? Yeah. You remember Theresa May once asked if she ever did anything wrong? Do you remember that? And she said she ran to a field of corn once.
Yes, it's kind of similar, but not as memorable as that. He just doesn't. He struggles with that basic connection, I think, with voters. And
yeah, the other thing that was striking about the ITV interview, to go back to D-Day, was very interesting from ITV News. They chose to start filming as Rishi Sunak came into the room before the official interview began, and they released footage from that point. And Rishi Sunak comes into the room, shakes Paul Brand's hand and says, "Oh, I'm sorry to keep you waiting. Things ran over. It was brilliant at the D-Day commemorations, but they ran over," suggesting that they had ended and that they had sort of kept him, which is again a bit strange to say.
I find it interesting that they broadcast that as well.
I thought that was interesting.
You could say that was really off camera. That's kind of pre-interview, off the record.
Yeah.
And the fact that they chose to broadcast that, I think, says something about the kind of shift in power. And they're not worried, not worried about losing the access.
The access,
because the access is going to end very soon anyway.
That was telling. And this point about him emphasising, well, I was at the British part of the commemorations. I mean, regardless of whether that is the case or not, or whether it is, as Adam says, for whatever reason, he doesn't like these big world events, which is very hard to fathom. What it allowed was, unfortunately, people in the Conservative Party to condemn their own prime minister in the middle of a general election campaign, which is a very bad look. It also allowed Nigel Farage to sound his dog whistles, saying that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand our culture.
Right.
Obviously,
what's that saying?
He's claiming plausible deniability that he didn't. It's not anything to do with Rishi Sunak being Hindu immigrant, immigrant son. It's just because he didn't understand the importance of D-Day and the Second World War to Britain. But those dog whistles are being sounded, I think, quite strategically. But the sad thing is that I think these dog whistles are unacceptable. It is nothing to do with the race or religion of the Prime Minister as to why he would leave that event. But Rishi Sunak is also the Prime Minister who refused to condemn remarks about Sadiq Khan apparently giving London to Islamists, which were made by former Deputy Chairman of the party, Lee Anderson. He refused to say that they were Islamophobic. He said that racism is wrong, but he would not say those comments were Islamophobic. And the problem is, once you start providing complicity to those sorts of tactics, unfortunately, you are going to be at the other end of those. They are going to come your way as well. And I think there's something there.
And of course, when you accept £10 million from somebody like Frank Hester, who said that Diane Abbott should be shot and made him want to hate all black women, of course, it's incredibly hypocritical to then sort of feign outrage at comments from Nigel Farage about Rishi Sunak.
I think it might be 15 million.
15 million, yes.
Yeah, I think that's the final.
Interesting question. Again, in this campaign, we have a few issues have dominated, I would say. Not much on climate, not much on other areas of domestic policy. I mean, the cost of living crisis and the economy and the NHS, very big issues, but we're not hearing much else domestically. But last night, there was a question from a member of the audience to Rishi Sunak. It was a woman of colour, asked him about institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia within the police. And Rishi Sunak answered, talking about the Met Police and obviously the horrific developments we've seen week in, week out with police officers being involved in criminality. But she said to him, do you understand the importance of accepting these issues as structural? And still didn't really get an answer on that. And what she was really, the context is clear. Yeah, she was asking, do you accept that institutional racism is a structural thing? And, Sunak, while he doesn't, I would give him credit, take the approach of inflaming things as perhaps Priti Patel or Suella Braverman would do on this, using their identity as immigrants. While he doesn't do that, he doesn't also accept what this lady was saying.
So I think this is a really big, when we get to another section, we'll come back to this issue, especially around Reform UK. But just to close this on the debates and this interview, it's a rather major thing, isn't it? Otto English writes about it in our current edition. So does Jonathan Liss. It's just literally gone to the printing presses today. D-Day, the war, these are huge totemic myths, aren't they? So him missing an event at G7, but they were some of the last surviving veterans from French, American, Polish there would be there, and British. The last time they will be on those beaches in Normandy, celebrating, liberating, along with, of course, the Soviets on the Eastern Front, Europe from fascism. And that is such a profound part of our national identity. It's the last kind of great thing we did since winning the World Cup, apart from winning the World Cup in 1966. I'm kidding, but, there's an element of that there. That was quite amazing lack of insight from his team. And do you know anything about his team? You know that James Forsyth, is it? He's the Spectator, his key aide. Why do you think they got that so wrong about D-Day?
He has a very small group of people around him who are incredibly loyal to him. And I think you can see that in how the news of the general election campaign wasn't leaked in advance. Nobody in Westminster knew that was coming.
Except somebody bet on it. Well, we might get to that.
Yes.
A senior
one of his closest aides did bet on
3 days before.
3 days before, as the Guardian reported.
And are there any consequences?
Yes, there's a police investigation.
Gambling commission investigation.
Right.
Yeah, it's quite serious.
He hasn't denied that he knew in advance. He was called by the BBC today.
But generally, you say it's quite a tight team.
Very tight team, very loyal, and that has advantages. But they're often criticised for being sort of yes men and yes women. They don't really sort of question him when he's wrong. And even though he does have some sort of external advisors, people like Isaac Levido, the campaign manager who's run previous Conservative campaigns, he defers to his closest advisors. So we saw that on the timing of the election, which Isaac Levido advised him that we should wait until later in the year when potentially the economy has turned around. And he ignored that and went along with his advice from his closest advisors, James Forsyth, former political editor at The Spectator, former boarding school best friend of his.
And best man.
And best man at his wedding.
So
So it's incredibly close-knit. And there are advantages to that, but it also, you end up being in a bit of a bubble. And I think that's a sort of broader problem for Rishi Sunak. He has lived his life in a bit of a bubble, and we've seen that, I think, definitely over the course of this campaign and how he struggled to connect with the voters.
So, just Hardeep, before we close this section, we're going to talk in a moment about the manifestos. Then we'll talk about the much neglected Lib Dems before we get on to Nigel Farage and reform. But just on this issue of D-Day, looking back, we're halfway through the campaign. To me, it's about like when we were covering a lot of the cronyism, corruption, false information, false science around COVID. These were big issues, but we didn't really cover, as The Guardian did brilliantly in the Mirror, the Partygate scandal. Right? That crossed over. That became defining, didn't it? For, there were many other things wrong with Johnson's administration, many other lies, many other things going on, but that became defining. Do you think, looking back over this first half of the campaign, the last 3 weeks, in a way the D-Day thing is going to stick in people's mind as the most prominent, more than him announcing it in the rain, more than these debates, more than anything else, the guy didn't get D-Day?
I think so. And I think that's because people in the military and the veterans themselves condemned him, and then people in the Conservative Party distanced themselves from him and criticised the move. So it, to be honest, in terms of the press, it's an ideal story, because it's not just members of the public might notice. He's actually being criticised in quite a valid way by people in quite prominent positions during a campaign. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I would say his administration has been defined by the culture wars. I mean, I think they really escalated them, took them further, put the Rwanda scheme at the heart of government. Boris Johnson obviously started that off, and then there was a very short amount of time with Truss. But it's really Sunak who's taken the culture wars forward. And so it's really strange that, given that, he didn't understand. I mean, I'm saying something cynical here. He didn't understand that something as important as the Second World War and D-Day, which you'd think he'd have at the first opportunity would try to weaponize in his favor and say, look, here I am on the world stage. But,
particularly when you're running like a campaign which is focused on winning older, more conservative voters.
And national
service and all the rest of it, to make that kind of error.
And I think what it shows, it actually exposes in quite a subtle way the gap because they've been running all these culture wars,
but don't understand.
But they
them.
don't actually understand the culture. They actually don't. When it comes to the culture that's actually important to people in this country, whether that's the NHS or our the Second World War and history, or our cultural institutions like the National Trust, for example, on those issues, they're quite far removed from what people actually think and feel about what they mean to the country. And so it's all very well keep going on about stop the boats or make divisive comments about the trans community and the woke academics. All of these are one thing, but actually what they betrayed is the culture is just a notion that they play with when it suits them. They actually have no understanding of it. And therefore, I think that's what people will take from that.
It's very interesting.
I mean, there has been some polling on actually what issues people are paying attention to. And very little is actually being paid attention to. So if you look at the BBC News or the Guardian News website and you look at this kind of most read articles, election stories are barely featuring in those stories. People are just not paying attention. It hasn't captured people's imaginations. The only two stories that have really captured anyone's attention at all are Rishi Sunak's announcement at the start in the rain. That got a lot of attention from people, obviously.
Not a great start.
Not a great start. And this D-Day story.
Yeah.
And so the Conservative Party went into this election 20 points behind, and all the way along they've been looking for sort of game-changing moments. Would it be the announcing national service? Would it be the debates?
Tax bombshells?
Would it be a tax bombshell? None of it seems to make any difference in the polls because the public aren't listening to them anymore. And the only thing they are noticing is Sunak being a bit incompetent and not understanding D-Day and so
Grimsby.
So that's really put a lid on any sort of recovery. And the expectation in Westminster for a long time is that as we got closer to the elections, the polls would narrow. And actually, they haven't. The Conservative poll rating is actually going downwards. Labour's has gone down a bit in the last week or so, but actually the gap between Labour and Conservatives actually I think it's up 1 point on it was a week ago. So there's no sign that anything is going to change. And we're only sort of about just over 3 weeks away from the.
And some people would have voted. They would have put their postal votes in. Yeah.
So what is that game changer going to be?
And it's extraordinary because it seems. I mean, I don't know if you feel this, Adam, but across the political spectrum, it seems now a factual thing to assert that the Conservatives have sort of lost the plot. The whole 14 years has been a disaster for the country. That seems to increasingly be something that those on the left and the right are acknowledging. Yeah. And I think that's an extraordinary place to get to.
Well, I think that's been the case for a couple of years, since the Liz Truss debacle. But it hasn't been. I think you're right. It hasn't been acknowledged in the sort of broader culture until now.
By the wider media.
By the wider media,
yes.
Yes.
Dave's good. So I think this, just to say, our polling, and Adams have supervised a lot of the polling, has always shown where there's trans issues, woke wars, national trust, and classically taking the knee during we got some Euro finals coming up this month. And the last time they were played 3 years ago because of the delay in COVID, all the attempts to weaponize taking the knee. Do you remember we had Boris Johnson, particularly Priti Patel going on? It's woke, it's virtue signaling. And the huge rebellion by the team.
So the actual culture, which was the pop stars and the footballers who have millions of followers, they were all like, this is appalling. And so the actual culture of this country exposed it for what it was.
So the actual culture. So the interesting thing is that you have allegations anyway of remoteness from the leadership, that somebody like Rishi Sunak lived a sort of slightly bubble life where not having a satellite dish was the worst affliction of his poverty he was afflicted with. And also strategists, partly from some money for Tufton Street, all that group of opaquely funded think tanks comes from America, and Isaac Levida and the Topham Guerin, they come from Australia and New Zealand, don't they? And it didn't work in Australia, but so maybe there is a sign of this remoteness. Do you think that's an element that actually when you get elitism happening by dint of schools, circumstance, wealth, these people do get disconnected from the country?
Absolutely. I think, there's a sort of broader problem for the Conservative Party for a long time. They've been sort of playing politics on easy mode, really, essentially, where, they've been allowed to get away with a lot over the last 14 years because large parts of the media have essentially been in their pocket for that period. And And it's only now that that we're getting so close to the election, and it's so obvious that the polls haven't shifted. If anything, they're getting worse for the Conservative Party. It's only now we're starting to get this acknowledgement, even from some of the most conservative supporting newspapers,
including what happened with the Sun.
Yeah, but with the Sun as well. Yeah,
I want to explain to the audience who may not follow. There's rumours. Has it happened yet? They're going to endorse Starmer.
Oh, I've not seen that, but I would not be surprised.
Sorry, that's something
you
I
say
picked
that
up.
the Murdoch press has been shifting in that direction, and particularly the Times. I think the recent local elections they came very close, I think, to endorsing Labour in those elections, and certainly they've been getting a lot more positive write-ups in the Sun. Although I think we discussed this last time, didn't we?
We did, but it's just the news from David Yellen, the former editor.
It's
a tip. It's not confirmed yet. They have decided to support Starmer, but I would say it's obviously a bit late in the day, and it's not like back in the 90s where they were weather makers. They're sort of weather followers. They're rule takers, not rule makers, and the whole thing's changed. Let's go on to, we'll come back to, because that is an amazing situation midway through an election to basically in some form concede defeat, and what that means for the right, and what that might mean for Labour. Let's just quickly, if it's relevant, before we go into Lib Dems who get overlooked too much, we feel, look at the manifestos. We had both the Conservative and Labour launch their manifestos in the last week. I mean, there were lots of accusations about false facts in the Conservative. Was there anything really in there? Was it just sort of bland pap in order not to any hostages to fortune? Anything really stick out in either manifestos?
Well, the Conservative, I think there's problems with the Conservative manifesto. They've essentially, they called it like the kitchen sink manifesto. They just chucked absolutely everything, every kind of possible tax cut. So the amount of, there's huge tax cuts in there. There's big spending increases, but there's no sense of how that's actually going to be paid for. I mean, in the costings, they say that it's going to be paid for by finding another 6 billion in tax avoidance from somewhere.
Oh, right.
And cutting welfare by 8 billion. But of course, we've already had extensive welfare cuts over the last 14 years, and actually the amount of cuts to welfare sort of ground to a halt in around 2015. Because you keep on squeezing and it becomes harder and harder politically to do. So it's not really credible at all. I think Labour's manifesto is very different. It's there's much less in there. I mean, there are some sort of welcome positions in there. I think on workers' rights in particular, there's big new measures on workers' rights, clamping down on 0 hours contracts, strengthening the minimum wage. There's a whole package of reforms there. I mean, they have been partially watered down in consultation with business over recent months. But I think taken together, that's going to be positive.
But you're saying there's slightly less detail in the Conservative one, in the Labour ones, because they might actually have to enact it. Where the Conservative could throw out this 8 billion cut to welfare when you've got rising homelessness and child poverty, because they know they won't have to follow through.
Yeah, but the costings in the Labour manifesto are actually they're tiny, really. We're talking about very small amounts of spending increases and very small amounts of tax increases. And given at the same time you have Keir Starmer saying, well, I'm not going to implement austerity, given that the austerity is pretty much baked into the government's plans as it stands, he's not really explaining how he's going to avoid austerity. I think either he's going to have to increase taxes, which he says he won't do, or he's going to have to borrow more money, or he's actually going to have to make the spending cuts that are baked in.
Just to explain to the audience, Jeremy Hunt's sort of last autumn statement was the budget kind of baked in, as Adam said, these cuts to public spending in order to justify their tax revenues.
And how they're getting around it is they're saying we have a growth strategy.
Right.
And it may be the case that, they luck out and the UK, we have a boom in the next couple of years.
We haven't recently, have we?
We haven't recently. And actually the OECD, the UK is forecast over the next year or so, a couple of years, to be the worst performing on growth of any of the G7 countries. So it's possible that will happen, but I think it's not looking likely at the moment. So I think they're deliberately trying to make the target from the Conservatives as small as possible. But I think realistically, once they're in government, we will have a spending review. And more than likely than not, we will suddenly hear a lot about how the finances were much worse than we all expected.
No money left.
No money left, and there will be further tax rises. I mean, Starmer in the event last night was very keen to say there will be no tax raises on working people.
Right.
What do you define as a working people? Does taxes on capital? Does capital gains tax? Is that a tax on?
He hasn't
working
excluded
people?
that. Just to explain, capital gains is what you sell your house or mainly shares, and it affects rich
Yeah.
people. There's a 25% break on it or something. It's
Yeah.
a low of 15, and he could put that up.
I think what he means by it is VAT and national insurance and income tax, which has all been explicitly ruled out in the manifesto. Of course, there are many other forms of tax that they can and most likely will levy if and when they get into government.
Hardeep, I mean, what did you make of the manifesto? Do you think, because you've got a great sense of the zeitgeist and what people are feeling, that by this point it's kind of academic to the audience? They don't trust the Conservatives. They're wary about Labour as long as they're just not as incompetent and scary and spooking the market and putting their mortgages up and price rises, they'll give them a break.
I think, as is characteristic of this general election campaign as a whole, there isn't much fanfare around these manifestos. You remember when we were kind of growing up and there'd be general election campaigns on the TV, and it'd be a massive thing when the manifesto was out, and journalists would spend hours and hours reading all of it, getting all the details, and really grilling the parties and representatives on it. But there isn't any of that, really. I do think it's, as Adam says, it's sort of a foregone conclusion that the public has checked out. It's quite surprising to see the media doing that or accepting that notion. But I don't think there's been huge amounts of scrutiny of these manifestos. I think partly it's because Labour will probably do a lot more in power than it says in the manifesto. The Conservatives are just sort of clutching at straws and trying to give everyone everything. But there isn't a sense that this election is really about policy. Yeah. It feels to me that the public wants some recognition of what it feels has gone badly wrong in our politics, and that is going to govern their decision making more than anything else. And what I mean by that is they feel contempt from politicians when they're partying in Downing Street during lockdowns. They feel complete incompetence from Liz Truss making people's mortgage payments go up. These big ticket issues are embedded in people's minds.
We should come back to that.
I don't think policies in a manifesto really shift the dial at all.
So we should come back to that, because that's a really interesting proposition. When did it completely go wrong for the Conservatives? Because their last election, 2019, biggest majority. But before we go to that, because with that invokes the unfortunate name of Nigel Farage. I mean unfortunate because everybody else talks about him. We have to talk about him because everybody else does, but we maybe not want to. And to avoid that a little bit, let's look at somebody else called Ed Davey. Now, Ed Davey, leader of the Lib Dems. Who's his deputy? Daisy Cooper.
Who's been appearing in the debates. Ed Davey has not appeared in the debate yet.
And I don't know if you've been following it. I'm sure you have, or if you're watching this, you probably have. Ed Davey seems to appear every day, either spinning around in a fairground, falling off a log, or a skateboard, or rowing, or abseiling, not abseiling, whatever you do, that water on the water with sails. And he seems to have the time of his life. But when asked why he was doing these sort of japes, it's almost like some sort of, 70s or 80s, one of those shows, like Mr. Blobby. There's always something crazy happening. And he explained why, didn't he? He had a good explanation why he was doing this.
Did he?
Yes, no. Okay. I'm the only one who followed it. He said to somebody, I'll track it down, I have to do this because nobody pays me any attention.
Yes.
They're all going after Farage and reform, and only get any airtime by these acrobatics and japes. Yet, as Adams, you point out, something extraordinary could happen looking at some of the latest projections.
Yes. Well, I think he's, when you're fourth in the polls, it's quite hard to get attention. And when everyone's focused on an incoming Labour government and what's happening with the Conservatives, it's very, very hard. And I guess it's kind of an indictment of our process that the only way that the sort of fourth party can get any attention at all is by sort of doing these stunts. But there is something sort of happening sort of under the hood really in this election that people aren't really paying attention to, which is that we in this country we have the first past the post voting system, which is designed to accommodate when you have two sort of fairly large parties who get around 30% of the vote to 45% of the vote. And that's what normally happens in general election campaigns. What it's not designed for is when you have one party with 40% plus in the vote, and then you have four parties who are all below 20% in the vote. And when that happens, strange things start to happen to the outcome of the election. And the most likely of those strange outcomes, if you look at the polls as they are now, and if you put those polls through seat forecasters, which estimate what it would mean in terms of seats, is that we could have a situation where the Lib Dems pick up a large amount of seats without actually increasing their share of the vote at all. And even if they're significantly behind the Conservatives and Lib Dems in terms of vote percentage, they could end up leapfrogging both Reform and the Conservatives and ending up as the new opposition party in the House of Commons.
So Ed Davey would be leader of the opposition.
And there's been quite a lot of polls in the last couple of weeks have pointed towards that as the likely outcome at the moment. Now, as I say, weird things happen and there's a huge margin of error and, lots could happen before polling day. But more often than not, polls over the last couple of weeks, that's what it's been pointing towards. And there's been very little discussion about what would happen if the sort of new landscape of British politics is a Labour government with a big majority and a Lib Dem opposition, when it's not British politics is not a debate between left and right, it's between left and liberal.
Yeah.
Or two centre-left, centre-right parties.
So let's dig down a little bit more on this, because to explain to people, so they're floating around the same percentage of the votes between 12 and 15 as the Reform, this new party, comes out of the ashes of the Brexit party, now led by Nigel Farage. But their vote is quite evenly spread and tends to take away from the
Reform's vote is very evenly spread around
and that's
the country.
not good, is it?
And that's not good in first past the post, because you want to concentrate your vote in seats that you can win.
Yeah.
Lib Dems are very good at concentrating their votes in seats that they can win. And actually they're in a lot of Conservative seats, they are second place. Yeah. So somewhere like Henley, which has been a Conservative seat for a very long time, there was that Rishi Sunak turned up by the river. Did you see that footage? A photo opportunity in Henley, and there was a Lib Dem boat going up and down the river behind him, sort of photobombing him. But actually, that seat, which has been Conservative as long as anyone can remember, looks likely to go to the Lib Dems now. And there are a lot of seats like that in prosperous rural and semi-rural areas around the country, particularly in the south of England, where they are best placed to win those seats from the Conservatives. So even if they don't get even if they only stick around 12 to 15%, they are in prime position to take those seats and get a massive increase. And actually Conservatives could end up, on sort of 50 seats, and Lib Dems could end up with sort of 70 to 80 seats and be the new opposition. So
this is the important thing, isn't it? That if there's a lot of tactical voting, there's sites that encourage you to tactical vote. And we'll get a bit more into that later, I've hated the last 14 years. I think it's been a complete disaster. You're going to look at how to get rid of the Conservative, and what you're saying is that if you're a Labour supporter in Henley, you'll go, well, I'll go for the Lib Dem.
And particularly in places like Henley, where Boris Johnson used to be the MP, and these parts of the country which don't have a history of voting for Labour. They're not post-industrial areas. They're not metropolitan seats. The opposition has always been the Lib Dems, but it's always been a relatively distant opposition. Because of the collapse of the Conservative Party, that's now changing. And, so while we're all talking about Ed Davey sort of dancing on tight ropes or whatever,
he fell off tight rope.
This could be the real sort of hidden story of this election, rise of the Lib Dems.
Yeah, and just to remember, if we could cast our mind back to 2015, none of you are so young you don't remember that. What was the shock of that election, which was deemed to be close, was the collapse of the Lib Dem vote after coalition.
Yes.
So a lot of those seats where they'd done well in 2010, they lost to everybody's surprise because of this shifting vote.
And I think this comes on to this new sort of campaign tactic that the Conservatives got, which is to say you don't want a supermajority, essentially conceding defeat three weeks before election campaign. And the reason they're doing that is because then they believe it will lead to tactical voting for them, people sort of wanting to stop. And the model they're looking at is what happened in 2017, when all the polls suggested that Theresa May was on course to get a big majority. And so people thought, well, I don't really like the idea of Theresa May having a big majority. That's the narrative that they're going. Whether or not that's true is, I think the
Corbyn factor was more important. Probably we could discuss that.
But so that's what they're pushing at. The problem is, by conceding defeat, actually people aren't bothered about Conservatives being wiped out. And there's some interesting polling this week showing that I think around 50% of voters said they would be quite happy if the Conservatives lost every single seat they've got in the country. And even a quarter of Conservative voters said they'd be quite happy if of Conservative voters in 2019 if Conservatives lost all of their seats. So this could actually backfire, and it could encourage people in those seats where Lib Dems are in opposition to go, oh, great, well, there's no point in voting for, even if I don't like Starmer, there's no point in voting for Conservatives because they're going to be completely wiped out. Let's go for the Lib Dems instead. And so that could actually boost the Lib Dems quite significantly over the coming weeks.
But what you're saying, Adam, is actually extraordinary when we stop to think that, how true it is that people have always said this is a fundamentally conservative with a small c country, conservative country. That's really striking.
Yes. Yeah.
But I guess, what is that notion of conservatism that is changing? Because the big C conservatives have now associated themselves with all sorts of national populist tactics, or sort of ultra-libertarianism, or sort of culture wars, where we've had the collapse of the actual Conservative Party and conservatism. Is this notion of conservatism now shifting? Actually, Starmer seems like a more conservative option for the country than the very radical and incompetent modern Conservative Party it is. There's something
certainly in terms of the manifestos as well.
It's interesting, isn't
Labour's
it?
manifesto is quite small c conservative in terms of fiscal policy. Whereas the Conservative manifesto is very unconservative, it's promising lots of spending and lots of tax cuts.
I think this is very important, isn't it? Because if we're going to diagnose in this landslide for Labour, or if you like, maybe more importantly, a collapse of British Conservatives, most successful party in the world, 200 years since Peel, there's a lot about it in the paper, has been the main governing party of this country, known famously as a conspiracy to gain power because it would change its policies. Macmillan was quite socialist, Churchill was in and out, Baldwin was quite centrist. They were known to be pragmatic rather than ideological. Obviously, Thatcher, the demise of Thatcher, they became quite ideological, split with John Major. And now it seems to be they are the disruptors. They're not conservative. So let's talk a figure along that line who I think indicates that. One would be, I'm not going to talk about him, we should do that later, we should write about him, is Dominic Cummings, who always said he wanted to destroy conservatism. He was Boris Johnson's advisor, campaign director for Vote Leave, and very radical in his use of data. He seems to have achieved that. But what's happening with this collapse of confidence is indiscipline. And maybe explain a bit more about a piece you put on today, Adam, about Andrea Jenkins. What's she up to?
Well, I mean, this strategy of essentially conceding defeat has just broke down any sort of bounds of discipline in the Conservative Party at all. So Andrea Jenkins, former education minister, I think she was.
Yeah. Famously, as education minister, and forgive me if I do this, gave the finger
yes,
up.
Yes, that's right. Very much on the sort of Brexiteer wing of the party. She put out some leaflets in the last couple of weeks, which I got a hold of a copy of one, and it doesn't feature the Conservative Party, it doesn't feature Rishi Sunak, it doesn't even feature David Cameron, who apparently offered to go on the leaflet for her, but it does feature two pictures of Nigel Farage.
I think I remember one of them. They were from his birthday party or something. She attended.
And she is an associate of Nigel Farage. And today she was endorsed by Andy Wigmore, who is also an associate of...
a very interesting man.
Nigel Farage.
Yes, he used to he was the head of communications for Leave EU.
Yes, the sort of bad boys of Brexit is what they call themselves. And so this is just remarkable. You have a Conservative candidate not willing to use the Conservative name, actually effectively sort of campaigning as a Reform candidate without actually being a Reform candidate.
So I remember when Alistair Campbell was then a member of the Labour Party, famously head of communications for Tony Blair, suggested tactical voting, Labour, I think in 2019, he was thrown out of the party. We know people like Encompass, who sometimes, this organisation has suggested tactical voting, vote for another party in this instance, they're thrown out of the Labour Party. No sanctions against them.
Well, it would be, I think in the Labour Party, definitely, it would be automatic suspension from the party, it'd lose the party whip. The problem is, she is no longer a Conservative MP because we're in the election period.
She's taken money also from another source.
She's taken money from Lawrence Fox's Reclaim Party in exchange for backing policies that aren't in the Conservative manifesto. I mean, it's just...
It's craziness.
It's bizarre. So the discipline is completely breaking down. And there's an interesting report in The Guardian today is breaking down on a sort of local level as well, is that they're just struggling to get any Conservative activists to actually turn out and knock on doors. I mean, they've lost a lot of Conservative councillors in the local elections, but... it just looks they look like a party that know they've lost. And
more than lost. It's not like it sounds like a party that's falling apart, Adam.
Yes, yeah, and all of the debate is not about how do we win this election or even what would we do in power if we had another term. It's about what happens after, and this constant talk about every time a Conservative MP is interviewed at moments now. Should Nigel Farage be welcomed into the Conservative Party? Should the two parties merge? And so they're already sort of talking about their own death as a political party really before it's happened.
For me, this self-destruction of the Conservative Party is a microcosm of the self-destruction of the country in the last 14 years. And what I mean by that is, we can sit here now and say, as you say, Peter, the Conservative Party, one of the most successful political parties in the Western world, always known for its pragmatism. And so what on earth is happening? Why have they done this to themselves? To be frank, is the obvious question. And it's just interesting to zoom out and think of what our friends and neighbours in Europe and elsewhere must have been thinking about Britain as a whole under the Conservative rule for the last 14 years. Why is this country doing all this stuff to itself? All this austerity, which America did not have after the financial crash. Then not a Brexit. I've always said if people wanted it, we should have done it. But the very hard version we've ended up with through people being misled has been self-destructive. The pandemic, the number of people who died that probably didn't need to, which is absolutely awful. There's something here that actually the last 14 years, running through the heart of it is the story of how the Conservatives have destroyed the country and destroyed themselves at the same time. And it is for that they will be punished, I think, at the ballot box.
And historically...
And they know that.
And let's be a bit clearer, because this austerity was a coalition government and the Lib Dem seem to have got away with... enforcing that and reneging on student tuition fees.
Well, they suffered for it in 2015.
But they're sort of washing it now.
But Conservatives didn't. The Conservatives it's taken longer for the Conservative Party to suffer in the way that the Lib Dems did back then.
But it's each time they've sort of surpassed themselves. I think this is what happened. The austerity, the cutting the state to the bone, then the EU referendum that was planned, and then it happened. Then the Brexit, the nature of the Brexit that happened, Boris Johnson, all the other prime ministers. Each time, it's like they've surpassed themselves, and the hubris has escalated.
I think austerity is kind of like the slow burn of what's happened.
That explains Brexit as well.
That explains so much. Yeah. But I think there's been these series of events which has kind of brought it home to people. I think Brexit was one of those, and what's happened since then. But I think Partygate kind of brought it home to people in a sort of personal way. People have been through COVID, that incredibly traumatic time, and to see that actually the government was behaving in a different way is always going to bring it home to people in a way that sort of policy discussions don't. And then, of course, Liz Truss, which brought it home to people's pockets, the Conservative Party no longer cared about it. It's kind of like a sort of perfect storm, which Rishi Sunak has found himself in. And although he's not sort of directly to blame for all of it, he's kind of carrying the can for what's
it's the lightning rod, isn't it?
And he's actually made it worse in how he's handled the last couple of years, and his lack of ability to sort of make a break from those years. And because what he could have done when he became Prime Minister is draw that line and say, find a way to kick Suella Braverman out of the party, or Liz Truss, or even Boris Johnson.
As Johnson had done in 2019 with Dominic Grieve and Asubri and the people who rebelled against.
And drawn a line, said, that's the past is the past. This is the new Conservative Party. I'm going to clear up the mess. This is the line that I draw in the sand. He didn't do that. And so now he is taking responsibility for everything that has happened before he became Prime Minister.
Yeah, because he took no action.
He took no action,
to
so there's
distance himself.
There's no line there. So
there's no. You're right, Adam. So he has to try and answer for all of
Yes.
it, and has no
and we
answers for
saw
any of
that
it.
in that event last night where he really couldn't do that.
So that the starting point you had of this is the national damage they've done, and that somehow this has damaged the Conservative Party from the outside, right? Brexit is a huge factor there because everybody, all these far-right European parties dropped exiting from there because it was seen to be a disaster. Maybe not as debating somebody, maybe not. It was a car crash in which we weren't decapitated, we're still hemorrhaging. So some people argue it's not that bad. But that clearly on the foreign stage. But then Ben Rose, who I think is Obama's advisor, was advised to Obama, look at the Conservative Party. That's an example of how quickly, in the modern age, a historic party with all this legacy can, and maybe
for me, I mean, you mentioned him earlier. Just on a personal note, really, you mentioned Dominic Cummings earlier. I mean, so much, as Adam says, so much had happened. But for me, and I know why Partygate resonated with the public. On a personal note, like as a journalist as well, I still remember watching Dominic Cummings in the Rose Garden, sitting at that trestle table, saying that he drove that car around Barnard Castle to test his eyes, and
with
for
his
me,
kid in the back.
That was and for me that was a seminal moment because it was almost so unbelievable that we were being asked to believe this. Like all of us collectively sat at home in lockdown, and we knew, like, how can we be possibly expected to swallow this? And Boris Johnson, they all rallied behind him. For me, there was something there that it was not only about hubris, it showed that they'd completely lost contact with sort of the fact that at the other end of these press conferences, at the other end of them being in Downing Street in this very elite world, it's real people. And you're actually telling people that you did that to test your eyes. There's something about it that was...
It's gaslighting, isn't it?
Yeah. It was that.
And I think that was the moment. I think you're right. That was the seminal moment. And that's, I think, when the public started to stop listening to them. And that's the problem. That's the main problem Rishi Sunak has now, is no matter what he does, no matter what he announces, nobody's listening anymore. And I think you're right. I think that started with Dominic Cummings. I think that started with Partygate as well.
And he had a huge role, of course, Dominic Cummings, in that election victory. Let's not forget. And some credit, I think, as we say in our editorial, Keir Starmer, when he took over the Labour Party in 2020 after 80-seat majority, this is the worst defeat for Labour since the 1930s, I think, in terms of their share of the vote, was deemed to be a sort of caretaker leader, a bit like Kinnock, when he'd made them get only 20 seats short, and then by 2030...
Well, he almost didn't survive. There was the
Batley and Spen. It was Hartlepool.
Hartlepool by-election.
And it had Batley and
He
Spen
came very close to resigning.
And he would have done a Batley and Spen.
There was briefings against him from his own cabinet saying he was too boring and wasn't connecting with people.
This is only in 2022.
Was it?
It was. We covered it. Yeah. So we had that sort of really edgy, and then suddenly he's looking at the biggest Labour majority, bigger than Blair's. So there's some credit to him. But I think you're right. That's a collapse of conservatism. So we've got a few more minutes just because we love these philosophical elements. You say, obviously 2019, Boris Johnson calls this winter election, sacked half the people. It's all about Brexit. Get Brexit done. We've had prorogation. We have, all these hard Brexits. He wins an 80-seat majority, and then COVID comes along. And this just proves, doesn't it, what you're saying about they are used to lying to us. I mean, hypernormalization, we know they're lying to us, and they know we know that, but we let them get away with it, right? You get away with spin. We had it. Think in that same Rose Garden, you had the beginning of the coalition government, you had Nick Clegg and Cameron. There's a whole new era of politics. We're used to this spin. But if they're incompetent, I'm wondering if it's that sense, and you see that Sunak, is they're not even efficient. Whatever you thought about Thatcher's policies, whatever you thought about that, even John Major, who was to the left of Thatcher, they were fairly competent. So they had the ERM moment, which destroyed Major. That we have glitz, sub-glitz, we have glibness, we have propaganda, we have spin, hypernormalization, but no clue about the culture like D-Day and no way to actually run anything.
And ultimately, I think that's what did for Jeremy Corbyn as well. I think we saw in the 2017 general election, that was a rare instance of actually a manifesto having an impact on a general election campaign, because a lot of those policies that he brought out were popular. But by the time the 2019 general election came around, the policies hadn't really changed, but people's opinions of Jeremy Corbyn had changed, and his own competence and because of the big divisions in the Labour Party,
particularly around the second vote over Europe.
Yeah, second vote over Europe, the anti-Semitism divisions in the party as well. People had just made up their minds that he wasn't competent, and I think that's that's what the Conservative Party. That's why the big reason why the Conservative Party have been such an effective political force over the past 100 years is that whether you like them or not, whether you agree with their policies or not, they've always managed to portray themselves as being conservative with a small c and looking after the finances. And that's what's been so damaging about these last few years, and particularly the Liz Truss episode, is they basically killed off the golden goose, has gone.
Hardeep, one final thought on this.
Yeah, I mean, I always remember what Dominic Grieve, the former Conservative Attorney General, said to us on Byline TV a couple of years ago. I mean, he was kicked out of the party in 2019. And he said, and it was his comments that made me understand conservatism better than anything else I'd heard. And he said, as an MP, people come into the constituency office and they're often really angry and frustrated about their lives. And they want answers, they want things done, and, they want people to blame. And he said he felt that the best of conservatism was listening to them, moderating those emotions and that visceral sense that nothing was working for people, and then being quite competent and offering them solutions as to how things could actually get solved. And he said, when instead of moderating those emotions, you're actually inflaming them through culture wars and xenophobia, as we saw through the Brexit campaign and all the way to Rishi Sunak's tenure. That is something that's very different from conservatism, and is almost like by stoking over a number of years these sort of divisions and these culture wars and all of this polarization and the controversy of all these big sort of policy changes to the country. It's they're in flames themselves, and I actually think it's a really interesting topic. I'm really glad we've spent a lot of time over it, because this is going to be a massive structural shift for the UK, I think. If we're looking at the destruction of the Conservative Party, that is a massive story in itself.
We should discuss that in our next episode. Thank you, Hardeep.
The self-destruction of the Conservative Party. It's that's the bit that people are missing off.
Yeah.
The self-destruction.
There is some in the new edition of Byline Times which hits the streets and your inboxes maybe tonight, tomorrow, mail out next week, and in the shops next week. We've put a lot of analysis on what's happened in the Conservative Party. Adam's written well about it. We've got this Russell Jones. We've got some great Jonathan Liss insights about it. And we will keep on talking about that, and whether, in fact, the British people are slightly smarter than the politicians think, because they didn't want inflammation, they wanted solutions. We'll also be announcing more about the Byline Festival, which takes place on the weekend after the election, and we're having a special election party on the night of the 4th at Dartington Hall in Devon. There are some last-minute tickets. You'll have all the regulars there. Myself, Hardeep, Adam, Josiah. We'll have Adrian Goldberg, Otto English, Sangeeta Miska, Alexandra Hawthorne, all there for an election night party, and we'll have a live broadcast like this. So meanwhile, thanks for tuning in today, and do tell your friends to watch on recap and catch up. We'll be back next week with more stunning tales from the earthquake of the 2024 general election.